Paddington Helps Out by Michael Bond. Chapter 5. Something nasty in the kitchen. 2 days? Exclaimed Mrs. Brown, staring at Dr. McAndrew in horror. Do you mean to say we've to stay in bed for 2 whole days?
Aye, said Dr. McAndrew. There's a nasty wee bug going the rounds, and if you don't, I'll no be responsible for the consequences.
But Mrs. Bird's away until tomorrow, said Mrs. Brown, and so are Jonathan and Judy, and that only leaves Paddington.
2 days, repeated Dr. McAndrew as he snapped his bag shut, and not a moment less. The house'll no fall down at that time. There's one thing, he added, as he paused at the door and stared at Mr. and Mrs. Brown with a twinkle in his eye. Whatever else happens, he'll no die of starvation. Yon wee bird's very fond of his insides.
With that, he went downstairs to tell Paddington the news.
Oh, dear, groaned Mr. Brown, as the door closed behind the doctor. I think I feel worse already.
Paddington felt most important as he listened to what Dr. McAndrew had to say, and he carefully wrote down all the instructions. After he'd shown him to the door and waved goodbye, he hurried back into the kitchen to collect his shopping basket on wheels. Usually with Paddington, shopping in the market was a very leisurely affair. He liked to stop and have a chat with the various traders on the Portobello Road, where he was a well-known figure. To have Paddington's custom was considered to be something of an honour, as he had a very good eye for a bargain. But on this particular morning, he hardly had time even to call in at the baker's for his morning supply of buns. It was early, and Mr. Gruber hadn't yet opened his shutters, so Paddington wrapped one of the hot buns in a piece of paper, wrote a message on the outside saying who it was from, and explaining he wouldn't be along for 11's that morning, and then pushed it through the letterbox. Having finished the shopping and then been to the chemist with Dr. McAndrew's prescription, Paddington made his way quickly back to number 32 Winter Gardens. It wasn't often Paddington had a chance to lend a paw around the house, let alone cook the dinner, and he was looking forward to it. In particular, there was a new feather duster of Mrs. Bird's he'd had his eye on for several days, and which he was anxious to test. I must say, Paddington looks very professional in that old apron of Mrs. Bird's, said Mrs. Brown later that morning. She sat up in bed, holding a cup and saucer. And it was kind of him to bring us a cup of coffee.
Very kind, agreed Mr. Brown, but I rather wish he hadn't brought all these sandwiches as well.
They are rather thick, agreed Mrs. Brown, looking at one doubtfully. He said they were emergency ones. Not quite sure what he meant by that. I do hope nothing's wrong.
I don't like the sound of it, said Mr. Brown. There have been several nasty silences this morning, as if something was going on.
He sniffed.
And there seems to be a strong smell of burnt feathers coming from somewhere.
Well, you'd better eat them, Henry, warned Mrs. Brown. He used some of his special marmalade from the cut-price grocer, and I'm sure they're meant to be a treat. You'll never hear the last of it if you leave any.
Yes, but 6, grumbled Mr. Brown. I'm not even very keen on marmalade, and at 12 o'clock in the morning. I shan't want any lunch.
He looked thoughtfully at the window and then at the plate of sandwiches again. No, Henry, said Mrs. Brown, reading his thoughts. You're not giving any to the birds. I don't suppose they like marmalade. Anyway, she added, Paddington did say something about lunch being late, so you may be glad of them. She looked wistfully at the door. All the same, I wish I could see what's going on. It's not knowing that's the worst part. He had flour all over his whiskers when he came up just now.
If you ask me, said Mr. Brown, you're probably much better off being in the dark. He took a long drink from his cup and then jumped up in bed spluttering.
Henry, dear, exclaimed Mrs. Brown, do be careful. You'll have coffee all over the sheets.
Coffee? Yelled Mr. Brown. Did you say this was coffee?
I didn't, dear, said Mrs. Brown mildly. Paddington did. She took a sip from her own cup and then made a wry face. It has got rather an unusual taste.
Unusual? Exclaimed Mr. Brown. It tastes like nothing on earth.
He glared at his cup and then poked at it gingerly with a spoon.
It's got some funny green things floating in it too, he exclaimed.
Have a marmalade sandwich, said Mrs. Brown. It'll help take the taste away." Mr. Brown gave his wife an expressive look.
2 days, he said,
sinking back into the bed.
2 whole days.
Downstairs, Paddington was in a bit of a mess. So, for that matter, was the kitchen, the hall, the dining room, and the stairs. Things hadn't really gone right since he'd lifted up a corner of the dining room carpet in order to sweep some dust underneath, and had discovered a number of very interesting old newspapers. Paddington sighed. Perhaps if he hadn't spent so much time reading the newspapers, he might not have hurried quite so much over the rest of the dusting. Then he might have been more careful when he shook Mrs. Bird's feather duster all over the boiler. And if he hadn't set fire to Mrs. Bird's feather duster, he might have been able to take more time over the coffee. Paddington felt very guilty about the coffee, and he rather wished he'd tested it before taking it upstairs to Mr. and Mrs. Brown. He was very glad he decided to make caw for himself instead. Quite early in the morning, Paddington had run out of saucepans. It was the first big meal he'd ever cooked, and he wanted it to be something special. Having carefully consulted Mrs. Bird's cookery book, he'd drawn out a special menu in red ink with a bit of everything on it. But by the time he'd put the stew to boil in one big saucepan, the potatoes in another saucepan, the peas in a third, the Brussels sprouts in yet another, and used at least 4 more for mixing operations, there was really only the electric kettle left in which to put the cabbage. Unfortunately, in his haste to make the coffee, Paddington had completely forgotten to take the cabbage out again. Now he was having trouble with the dumplings. Paddington was very keen on stew, especially when it was served with dumplings, but he was beginning to wish he'd decided to cook something else for lunch. Even now he wasn't quite sure what had gone wrong. He had looked up the chapter on dumplings in Mrs. Bird's cookery book and followed the instructions most carefully, putting 2 pots of flour to 1 pot of suet and then adding milk before stirring the whole lot together. But somehow, instead of the mixture turning into neat balls, as it showed in the coloured picture, it had gone all runny. Then, when he'd added more flour and suet, it had gone lumpy instead and stuck to his fur, so that he'd had to add more milk and then more flour and suet until he had a huge mountain of dumpling mixture in the middle of the kitchen table. All in all, he decided, it just wasn't his day. He wiped his paws carefully on Mrs. Bird's apron and, after looking around in vain for a large enough bowl, scraped the dumpling mixture into his hat. It was a lot heavier than he had expected, and he had a job lifting it up onto the stove. It was even more difficult putting the mixture into the stew, as it kept sticking to his paws, and as fast as he got it off with one paw, it stuck to the other. In the end, he had to sit on the draining board and use the broom handle. Paddington wasn't very impressed with Mrs. Bird's cookery book. The instructions seemed all wrong. Not only had the dumplings been difficult to make, but the ones they showed in the picture were much too small. They weren't a bit like the ones Mrs. Bird usually served. Even Paddington rarely managed more than 2 of Mrs. Bird's dumplings. Having scraped the last of the mixture off his paws, Paddington pushed the saucepan lid hard down and scrambled clear. The steam from the saucepan had made his fur go soggy, and he sat in the middle of the floor for several minutes getting his breath back and mopping his brow with an old dishcloth. It was while he was sitting there, scraping the remains of the dumplings out of his hat and licking the spoon, that he felt something move behind him. Not only that, but out of the corner of his eye he could see a shadow on the floor which definitely hadn't been there a moment before. Paddington sat very still, holding his breath and listening. It wasn't so much of a noise as a feeling, and it seemed to be creeping nearer and nearer, making a soft swishing noise as it came. Paddington felt his fur begin to stand on end as there came the sound of a slow plop, plop, plop across the kitchen floor. And then, just as he was summoning up enough courage to look over his shoulder, there was a loud crash from the direction of the stove. Without waiting to see what it was, Paddington pulled his hat down over his head and ran, slamming the door behind him. He arrived in the hall just as there was a loud knock on the front door, and to his relief he heard a familiar voice call his name through the letterbox.
I got your message, Mr. Brown, about not being able to come for 11s this morning,
began Mr. Gruber as Paddington opened the door.
And I just thought I would call round to see if there's anything I could do.
His voice trailed away as he stared at Paddington.
Why, Mr. Brown, he exclaimed, you're all white. Is anything the matter? sorry, Mr. Gruber, cried Paddington, waving his paws in the air. It's only some of Mrs. Bird's flour. I'm afraid I can't raise my hat because it's stuck down with dumpling mixture, but I'm very glad you've come because there's something nasty in the kitchen. Something nasty in the kitchen? Echoed Mr. Gruber. What sort of thing? I don't know, said Paddington, struggling with his hat, but it's got a shadow and it's making funny noise. Mr. Gruber looked round nervously for something to defend himself with. We'll soon see about that, he said, taking a warming pan off the wall. Paddington led the way back to the kitchen and then stood to one side by the door. Afternoon, Mr. Gruber, he said politely. Thank you, Mr. Brown, said Mr. Gruber doubtfully. He grasped the warming pan firmly in both hands and then kicked open the door. Come out, he cried, whoever you are. I don't think it's a who, Mr. Gruber, said Paddington, peering round the door. It's a what? Good heavens, exclaimed Mr. Gruber, staring at the sight which met his eyes. What has been going on? Over most of the kitchen there was a thin film of flour. There was flour on the table, in the sink, on the floor, in fact over practically everything. But it wasn't the general state of the room which made Mr. Gruber cry out with surprise. It was the sight of something large and white hanging over the side of the stove. He stared at it for a moment, and then advanced cautiously across the kitchen and poked it with the handle of the warming pan. There was a loud squelching noise, and Mr. Gruber jumped back as a part of it broke away, and it fell with a plop to the floor. Good heavens, he exclaimed again. I do believe it's some kind of dumpling, Mr. Brown. I've never seen quite such a big one before. He went on as Paddington joined him. It's grown right out of the saucepan and pushed the lid onto the floor. No wonder it made you jump. Mr. Gruber mopped his brow and opened the window. It was very warm in the kitchen. However did it get to be that size? I really don't know, Mr. Gruber, said Paddington, looking puzzled. It's one of mine, and it didn't start off that way. I think something must have gone wrong in the saucepan. I should think it has, said Mr. Gruber. If I were you, Mr. Brown, I think I'd turn the cooker off before it catches fire and does any more damage. There's no knowing what might happen once it gets out of control. Perhaps, if you would allow me, he continued tactfully, I can give you a hand. It must be very difficult cooking for so many people. It is when you only have paws, Mr. Gruber, said Paddington gratefully. Mr. Gruber sniffed. I must say, it all smells very nice. If we make some more dumplings quickly, everything else should be just about ready. As he handed Paddington the flour and suet, Mr. Gruber explained how dumplings became very much larger when they were cooked, and that it really needed only a small amount of mixture to make quite large ones. No wonder yours were so big, Mr. Brown, he said as he lifted Paddington's old dumpling into the washing-up bowl. You must have used almost a bag of flour. 2 bags, said Paddington, looking over his shoulder. I don't know what Mrs. Bird will say when she hears about it. Perhaps if we buy her some more, said Mr. Gruber as he staggered into the garden with the ball, she won't mind so much. That's odd, said Mr. Brown as he stared out of the bedroom window. There's a big white thing suddenly appeared in the garden, just behind the nasturtiums. Nonsense, Henry, said Mrs. Brown. You must be seeing things. I'm not, said Mr. Brown, rubbing his glasses and taking another look. It's all white and shapeless and it looks horrible. Mr. Curry's seen it too. He's peering over the fence at it now. Do you know what it is, Paddington? A big white thing, Mr. Brown, repeated Paddington vaguely, joining him at the window. Perhaps it's a snowball. In summer, said Mr. Brown suspiciously. Henry, said Mrs. Brown, do come away from there and decide what you're having for lunch. Paddington's gone to a lot of trouble writing out a menu for us. Mr. Brown took a large sheet of drawing paper from his wife, and his face brightened as he studied it. It said, Menu. Soup. Fish, omelettes, roast beef, stew with dumplings, potatoes, Brussels sprouts and peas, cabbage and gravy, marmalade and custard, and coffee. "How nice!" exclaimed Mr. Brown when he'd finished reading it. "And what a good idea putting pieces of vegetable inside as illustration. I've never seen that done before."
"They're really not meant to be there, Mr. Brown," said Paddington. "I'm afraid they came off my paws."
"Oh," said Mr. Brown, brushing his moustache thoughtfully. Well, you know, I rather fancy some soup and fish myself."
"I'm afraid they're off," said Paddington hastily, remembering a time when he'd once been taken out to lunch and they'd arrived late.
"Off?" said Mr. Brown. "But they can't be. No one's ordered anything yet."
Mrs. Brown drew him to one side. "I think we're meant to have the stew and dumplings, Henry," she whispered. "They're underlined."
"What's that, Mary?" asked Mr. Brown, who was a bit slow to grasp things at times. Oh, I see. On second thoughts, Paddington, I think perhaps I'll have the stew."
"That's good," said Paddington, "because I've got it on a tray outside already."
"By Jove," said Mr. Brown, as Paddington staggered in, breathing heavily and carrying first one plate and then another piled high with stew. "I must say I didn't expect anything like this."
"Did you cook it all yourself, Paddington?" asked Mrs. Brown. "Well, almost all," said Paddington truthfully. "I had a bit of an accident with the dumplings, and so Mr. Gruber helped me make some more." "You're sure you have enough for your own lunch?" said Mrs. Brown anxiously. "Oh, yes," said Paddington, trying hard not to picture the kitchen. "There's enough to last 4 days and days."
"Well, I think you should be congratulated," said Mr. Brown. "I'm enjoying it no end. I bet there aren't many bears who can say they've cooked a meal like this. It's fit for a queen."
Paddington's eyes lit up with pleasure as he listened to Mr. and Mrs. Brown. It had been a lot of hard work, but he was glad it had all been worthwhile, even if there was a lot of mess to clear up. "You know, Henry," said Mrs. Brown as Paddington hurried off down the stairs to see Mr. Gruber, "we ought to think ourselves very lucky having a bear like Paddington about the house in an emergency." Mr. Brown lay back on his pillow and surveyed the mountain of food on his plate.
"Dr. MacAndrew was right about one thing," he said. "While Paddington's looking after us, whatever else happens, we certainly shan't starve."